Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Jennifer Duke. The Matildas might be the topic of conversation at most barbecues and water coolers right now, but it's a safe bet that the property market isn't far behind. And there's plenty to discuss. Yesterday, National Cabinet announced additional measures aimed at tackling housing affordability, and it's really all about improving supply. Talking to me about the housing market today is Tim Lawless, Head of Research for CoreLogic. Tim, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Many thanks, Jen. It's great to be here.
So, Tim, just how bad is the housing affordability situation in Australia right now?
Well, it depends what aspect you're looking at. Some areas of affordability have actually improved over the past year or so because housing values are generally still below their peak from last year, even though they're starting to rise again. So that means the dwelling value to income ratio has actually come down a little bit. So markets like Sydney, which we know are the most unaffordable, has seen that ratio fall from above 10 times, simply meaning that your median household would have to spend 10 times their gross income to buy the median price dwelling. That's come down to below 10 now. It's sort of around the high eights. So that's good. But if you look at affordability in another measure, like how much income is a household dedicating to servicing the debt or servicing a mortgage, that's risen to new record highs. And the latest data we have is to March, and no doubt it's increased even further from there. And then you've got rental affordability, and that's also blown out simply because we've seen such rapid rises in rents alongside pretty decent rises in incomes, but certainly not as much as what rents have risen. So a few different ways to cut it, but whatever way you look at housing, it's generally a fairly challenging affordability situation.
That sounds pretty painful for quite a few households. And clearly, supply is a really big issue in this space, particularly in the capital cities. What have been some of the issues that have led up to this situation where we have such a low level of supply to that relative demand?
Well, supply, in one way, if you were to look at a graph at the moment on how many homes are being built, it's just moved through record highs. We're actually building a lot of homes at the moment, but the reality is there's not a lot coming in behind it. Dwelling approvals have plummeted since the end of the home builder grants back in March of 2021. So that's the real risk at the moment, is that even though we're seeing this significant boom in construction activity that's been prolonged because it's run into a whole bunch of bottlenecks and supply chain constraints and materials and labor shortages. So it's been a real extended construction cycle. After this period of construction's completed, which is imminent, there's not a lot in the pipeline. And that's the real risk. If you look at some of the forecasts for housing supply, NIFIC, for example, estimate the Australian housing market will be undersupplied all the way through to 2028. So, it really comes simply back to very, very high levels of population growth at the moment, coupled with a relatively subdued pipeline of approvals in the wings.
So with that in mind, do you reckon the government's newly announced National Planning Reform Blueprint that's aimed at increasing supply will make much of a difference?
Well, if they can achieve it, absolutely. This is a pretty aspirational target, I think, of 1.2 million homes over a 5-year period. But the reality is, this target of 1.2 million homes to be built over 5 years doesn't kick off until July 2024. So it's nearly a year away. And it doesn't really solve the immediacy of this housing crisis that we have at the moment. Another way to look at it as well is, if you look historically, we've never achieved building 1.2 million homes in a 5-year period. The closest Australia's ever got to it was in the 5 years ending December 2019, and we built nearly 1.1 million homes. So to my point, this is pretty aspirational, and such an aspirational target comes at a time when supply is almost moving from a standing start. Sure, you've got a lot of homes being built at the moment, but like we just talked about, the supply pipeline is really low. So we're going to have to start seeing approvals ramping up pretty quickly in order to achieve this target over 5 years.
And one of those things that we've been seeing a lot over the past, 12 months or so has been builders going under and some skills shortages and issues in that space. This doesn't sort of fix those problems. So is this going to compound the issue, do you think?
Well, potentially, and that's probably one of the biggest challenges here, is we're once again trying to push a lot of supply into the market that we need, but we don't have the right foundations. And this is exactly the sort of dilemma that the market ran into after the home builder program, which was very popular. It was a good policy, I think, on paper at least, but it just ran into a huge amount of supply chain constraints. Not that we're going to run into another COVID, or hopefully not, over the coming 5 years.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed, knock on wood. To your point, I think we need to be focusing a lot more on getting the foundations right in, really getting a more significant skill set in place, which in itself takes a long time. You can import that skilled migration, but I think a much better way to do it would, or a complementary way would be to be really focusing on training and trades and getting people trained up locally, domestically.
Stay with me, Tim. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Tim Lawless, Head of Research for CoreLogic. There is another piece in there, though, because obviously supply is sort of one half of the equation. Do you think they need to do a bit more about demand?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure how much they talked about demand at the National Cabinet. I didn't see anything in the media. No doubt that we'll be seeing more coming out about it. But demand at the moment is really stemming from the rapid rate of overseas migration. And it looks like that's set to stay for some time. Even though we've probably already moved through the peak level of net overseas migration last financial year, the budget papers were forecasting net migration to remain well above average over the next 5 years. So if there's going to be a discussion around demand, it probably involves pulling back on the lever a little bit around net overseas migration, or potentially really trying to ramp up the supply side, which is exactly what the National Cabinet focus was trying to deliver.
Definitely. And we're obviously not that far from spring now, which is, of course, peak real estate time. I think you guys will be very, very busy. What are you expecting to see in terms of listings?
Well, we're already starting to see listings picking up, and this is really unusual for this time of the year. Normally, winter is quite subdued for the flow of new listings coming on the market. But winter to date has actually seen about a 13% lift in the number of new listings coming on the market. The long run average, when you look at listings coming into the Australian market between autumn and winter, is normally about a 5% drop. So to see a 13% rise in new listings now, I think signals that spring and early summer this year is going to be quite an active one. And of course, it comes after last year's spring was a non-event. It was the first time ever we've seen the number of new listings coming on the market was lower than what it was in winter. So finally, we're starting to see some more supply, at least available or advertised supply, coming into the market, which, it'll be really interesting to see if that's actually met with a commensurate level of demand. Because at the moment, demand is a little bit stifled. So you've got sentiment really low, and that in itself makes people less willing to make a high commitment decision like buying a home. But you've also got the finance side of things still very tight, interest rates high, so serviceability is quite challenging as well. So chances are we will see a pretty decent uplift in the number of homes available for sale, but not as much of a rise in demand. And if that is the case, if I'm right about that, you'd have to think that's going to take some heat out of the this recent upswing we've been seeing in housing prices.
That was going to be the next thing on my mind is what do you reckon will happen to prices for the rest of this year? Because you can't not ask that question to anyone in real estate. Any big forecasts that you have that you want to share?
Well, we've already started to see the pace of growth slowing in some markets where listings have risen more materially. So Sydney and Melbourne are the best examples of that. Sydney's rate of growth has halved from between May, when values are rising at 1.8% month on month. That's already slipped back to 0.9%, so it's halved. And Sydney's seen listing numbers, total listings, rise by a little bit more than 5% since May. So I think if we do start to see more supply, then arguably you will start to see the rate of growth easing off, probably still remaining positive. And if you look at most of the forecasts for housing markets, they're generally suggesting, say, the combined capitals will be up 6 to 7% over the full calendar year. That in itself implies a slowdown through the second half of the year, which I would agree with.
And you've released a regional property report this week as well. Can you talk us through how those regional areas are responding to the rising rates that we've been seeing?
Yeah, it's quite the mixed bag. And if you looked at regional markets sort of through the height of the pandemic, of course, they really stood out as the best performers, where now it seems to be completely the opposite of that. The capital cities are outperforming their regional counterparts. Some regional markets still traveling backwards in terms of values. And most of those areas that remain quite soft for value growth tend to be the markets that were some of the most popular through the pandemic. So areas like the Southern Highlands, just outside of Sydney, would be a good example. Their value's still down over the quarter, but they increased by about 60% through the upswing.
Wow.
Yeah, crazy. Byron Bay or the Richmond Tweed area, values there are already down 20% and only now just starting to stabilize. But it does look like some of the more commutable regional markets, areas like Wollongong or Newcastle, the Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, are all moving back into some level of growth now. And then if you look a little bit longer term, say the past 12 months, a lot of the rural markets that are generally quite affordable and a little bit more disconnected from the interest rate hiking cycle, areas like Mackay or Cairns or getting down to Bunbury in WA or southeast South Australia, have generally recorded positive growth even over the past 12 months, despite this rapid rate hiking cycle.
That's amazing, isn't it? Really. You sort of feel like you're expecting people to be much more sensitive to the higher rates. We do hear a lot about the mortgage cliff, though, and that's still coming. Do you have a thought on whether or not we're just yet to feel the full brunt of the rates?
I think that'll take a while. We've pretty much fallen off the cliff now. We've moved through the peak. So according to most of the bank reporting and the RBA, the peak in this fixed rate transition was June, July, August. So it kind of just moved through it or moving through it at the moment. So I think it will take some time to see what the level of fallout is going to be. You know, the official data are just looking at data on, say, mortgage arrears. CBA just had their full year reporting, for example. They're still reporting really low levels of mortgage arrears. Like APRA was reporting 99.5% of all borrowers were on track with their mortgage repayments. So there's yet to really be any major signs of fallout. But I think we'd be pretty naive to think there's not going to be a lift in mortgage arrears. I think everyone is expecting that to happen. It's really, how much is it going to rise and when is it going to start to show up? I think the good news for borrowers is everybody expects unemployment to remain pretty tight, even though labour markets will loosen. As long as labour markets don't implode, I think most people that want a job will have one and stay on track with their repayments. But it does imply a really pretty significant pullback in discretionary spending in order to do that.
Tim, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Absolute pleasure, Jennifer. Thanks for the invitation.
And that was Tim Lawless, Head of Research for CoreLogic. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's best business podcast. I'm Jennifer Duke, economics correspondent at Capital Brief, and filling in for Sean Elmer. Have a great day.